Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the terrifying Vaughn Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about the essential classics of horror. This is a video series I'm doing, the essential classics of horror, an ongoing series that I got the idea for this series of videos from my good friend Troy Tradup over on his channel. He started a series about essential modern horror books, books that he feels are essential to modern horror. He put that series on hold because of work, but I am hoping that he revives that series in one form or another because it seemed to be like a really interesting series. But it did give me an idea to do that with classic horror. So this series, the essential classics of horror. This series is just about that, the essential classics, what I feel are the essential classics in horror fiction. I've always been interested in horror. I've always loved horror. And I've always been really interested in the older stuff. If you've watched my channel at all, you know I'm into the older stuff. But I've always loved classic horror. I've always loved the authors who wrote classic horror. This is the horror that all modern horror is based on. Modern horror is based on a number of things. Not just horror fiction, but also films. The horror movies that have come out over the years have had a lot of influence on modern horror fiction. Not so much in the older stuff, though. Most of the older horror that I'll be talking about, most of that stuff is based on other literature and stories and tales and sometimes legends and myths. It's an interesting kind of fiction. And there's a lot of great stuff in this genre. So what are the classics that I'll be talking about? Who are the authors that I'll be talking about? There are a number of them. I kind of thought of doing this series at first in chronological order, like I would go to the oldest stuff first and then travel on through the years. I decided against that. I thought it would be more fun to skip around in time. Roger actually knows all about skipping around in time because he's got a time machine, but he won't let me use it. I was actually going to use it, Roger, and I still think this is a good idea, to go back in time and interview all of these authors who wrote these classic works and then put them in the video. I think that would be great, but he just says I'll rip apart the fabric of time and space and reality. I don't know. He's always worried about that kind of thing. So yeah, I'll just have to talk about him. I can't interview any of them. He won't let me use the time machine. Anyway, to continue after that digression, classic horror in this case, as far as what I'll be covering, it's going to end around the 1940s. So it's classic horror up through the 1930s. That's where Troy kind of cut it off, I think, on his list of books. And I think that's a good place, in the 1940s. So up through the 1930s, those are the classics I'll be talking about. As for what those are, I'm going to be talking about specific books and authors, and I'm also going to be talking about the editions you might want to pick these books up in. There are some classics where it doesn't matter so much, like if it's Dracula, most of the classics editions, whether you get, Penguin Classics or Oxford or whoever, usually the text is going to be good enough. Usually it's going to be a good sound text. But there are other writers, particularly if they wrote short stories, where the volume you pick up, it makes a difference. And so I'm going to be talking about specific editions as well, so that, you've never heard of this writer, or you've never read this writer before, or this book before. Which edition do I pick up? I'm hoping this video series will be helpful for that. As for what I'm actually going to be talking about, I've got a few books here that I'm going to share with you today to give you an idea about what's coming in the future. This isn't everything, but this is a few books, so you get the idea. The first book and the first episode that I'm going to be doing on the series is going to be Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein, which is considered by many to be the first science fiction book ever written. And I think that's correct. I also think this is probably, when you think of what science fiction is, this is probably the first real example of that. But, of course, Frankenstein, the first thing you think of when you think Frankenstein is horror. This had a tremendous influence on horror fiction ever after this was written. Certainly, when we think of Frankenstein, we think of horror probably more because of the films. There have been a million films about Frankenstein. But the book is something very different than most of those films. A lot of people that have heard of Frankenstein have never read the book. A lot of horror fans actually have never read the book Frankenstein. So I'm going to be talking about this book. I've talked about it before, but I am going to be talking about it again. I read this recently. I have some new ideas about it. I have some ideas about why it is such a classic of horror literature. So yeah, Frankenstein, this is going to be the first episode I do. Now you can only follow that up. You can only follow that up with Dracula. Dracula, one of the greatest and most important horror novels ever written. This kind of looms over the whole genre, Dracula does. Not everybody who reads this book loves it, but it's a very important book, and I don't think its importance can really be denied, really. People will, but I don't think it really could logically be denied. This is a really important book in the horror genre, Dracula. So, yeah, obviously we have to talk about Dracula. And another one. What? Speaking of horrible monsters. Speaking of horrible monsters. Why are you so terrifying? Why do you have to frighten the people? Why do you have to frighten everybody when I'm trying to do this very important video? You know, essential classics of horror? Oh well. Will she frighten us again? We'll see, probably. She's very badly behaved, that little goblin. See? Fawn Manor has its own goblin. There you go. Where was I? Oh, yes. When we're thinking of the big three, as far as horror classics are concerned, you have Frankenstein, you have Dracula, and you have this. This is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. A very short novel, or novelette, or just long short story, however you want to think of it. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is incredibly important as far as horror fiction goes. Often, it is considered by many to be a kind of werewolf novel. So you would have the three archetypes, you know, Frankenstein, Dracula, and a werewolf. Although it's not exactly that. It'll be an interesting book to discuss. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is the Oxford edition, which also has some of his other stories which are considered horror. Some of them, like The Body Snatcher, are always in these volumes of Robert Louis Stevenson's horror stories, usually paired up with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because that book is just so short. So we are going to be talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, of course, you cannot talk about the essential classics of horror without talking about Edgar Allan Poe. This edition is just the Bantam edition of The Telltale Heart and other writings by Edgar Allan Poe. When it comes to Edgar Allan Poe, I mean, he's so important. He is so important. I mean, he is... I mean, you cannot argue that he's not essential, because he's so essential to horror. And as far as his work is concerned, most of these classics volumes, most of them will have most of the stories you're going to want to read if you're going to want to read Edgar Allan Poe for the first time. I don't think it's particularly helpful if you're interested in the history of horror fiction to read the complete stories of Edgar Allan Poe. Not all of his stories were horror. He wrote a lot of different kinds of things. But certainly, most of these volumes will have most of the stories that you're going to want to read for Edgar Allan Poe. And so we'll be talking about that as well as Poe himself. This, I think, is actually a pretty good volume to read if you're reading Poe for the first time, just because of the contents. And so I'll be talking about that. What else will I be talking about? Because I've talked about these major novels and stories that we've heard so much about. There are some unexpected ones, though, perhaps, like H.G. Wells will also be making an appearance. A couple of his novels can also be considered horror, including this one, The War of the Worlds, which, of course, is a very important science fiction novel, but it does have its horror elements, which are essential, actually, to the novel. So we're going to be talking about that book. We're also going to be talking about The Island of Dr. Moreau, an incredibly important horror novel. I think that actually, it is a science fiction novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau, but I think it's more of a horror novel, actually, and a really important one. So we're going to be talking about H.G. Wells. Of course, we're going to be talking about The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. This is the beautiful folio edition that Troy Tradup sent me. But this is also the same text, I believe, that you could find in the Oxford edition. When it comes to The Phantom of the Opera, the text that you read, the translation that you read, is kind of important. Some of the newer translations are a lot better, but I'll be getting more into that when I talk about the book itself. Other books we will be talking about: Algernon Blackwood, an essential writer of horror. Algernon Blackwood, he wrote The Willows, for example, which is considered by many to be the greatest weird story ever written. H.P. Lovecraft thought it was. I think he's probably right. He wrote some great horror stories, disturbing stories. This here is the best ghost stories of Algernon Blackwood. There are a couple of editions of Algernon Blackwood you can get that you'll be well served by. I think this one, if you have to pick just one, it's probably going to be this. But very important writer. We'll be talking more about him in this series. Bram Stoker, a writer we just mentioned for Dracula, did have some other things I think are worth reading. In particular, his short story collection, Dracula's Guest. This collection of short stories was great. I think it's a very important collection of short stories, so we will be talking about that. I don't know that we can talk about essential classics of horror without talking about this classic Gothic work. This is The Castle of Atronto by Horace Walpole. A short little book, very important, though, to the history of horror fiction. So we're going to be discussing this. And if we're discussing that Gothic work, you know we have to discuss this naughty book, The Monk by Matthew Lewis. Have to talk about The Monk, man. We have to talk about The Monk. So we're definitely going to be talking about Matthew Lewis's The Monk. I actually look forward to reading that again. Very much so. Then we've got some other stuff which is kind of interesting. There are some other writers who wrote some great short horror fiction. Probably the master of the ghost story is M.R. James. Have to talk about M.R. James, the guy who wrote some of the most disturbing ghost stories ever, with some of the most terrifying and dangerous ghosts that you will ever encounter in English. These are just horrifying entities that you will encounter in M.R. James stories. So yeah, I've got the Collected Ghost Stories by M.R. James, the Oxford edition. This is the one to get, I think, and we'll be talking about this in the future. He admired greatly another writer, Sheridan Lifanu, probably best known for writing Carmilla. But here we have Green Tea and Other Weird Stories, which is probably the best one-volume edition of Sheridan Lifanu that I can think of. So we will be talking about this book in the series. We will also be talking about Robert W. Chambers' incredibly disturbing The King in Yellow. The King in Yellow and Other Horror Stories. This edition by Dover is pretty good, if you can get over the cover. This edition of The King in Yellow is great because it has not only the stories, the horror stories from that important collection, The King in Yellow, but it also has other horror stories that Chambers wrote. He wrote a lot of stuff that wasn't horror, but this, I think, is essential and important. And still, it is still very disturbing and unnerving today if you read this stuff. I look forward to talking about this one. There's also some stuff coming up that's going to seem a little obscure because they're not books or stories that we hear a lot about. Like this. This is The Rim of Morning, Two Tales of Cosmic Horror by William Sloan. This has a couple of different novels. There's two different novels in here. To Walk the Night and The Edge of Running Water. Both written in the 1930s. They are cosmic horror stories, but very different from the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft. These books have some of the most creepy moments that you will find in horror. They're fascinating books. And so I look forward to talking more about these. Talking about classic horror, we cannot ignore the creator of Sherlock Holmes. He wrote a bunch of creepy stuff, which you can find in this volume. This is Gothic Tales by Arthur Conan Doyle. He wrote a lot of different stories which are considered horror stories, and really good horror stories. So you can find them in this volume. We will be talking about this. And of course, even though I'm going to be talking about this guy in his own show, we can't not talk about H.P. Lovecraft and the work of H.P. Lovecraft. This is The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories. This is the first volume in the 3-volume Penguin set. Penguin produced 3 volumes of H.P. Lovecraft. And if you get those 3 volumes, you're getting all of the great horror that H.P. Lovecraft wrote. But if you're approaching Lovecraft for the first time, and Lovecraft is not for everyone, as great as he was. I understand not everybody loves Lovecraft. It seems inexplicable, but it's true. So if you're approaching Lovecraft for the first time, I still think that this is the best place to start. Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories. It's a dynamite collection put together by scholar S.T. Joshi. And it's great because if you like this, you can move right on to the other 2 volumes. And if you read the other 2 volumes, you will have read everything great that H.P. Lovecraft wrote. But if you just want to start and see if you like him, this is a good place to start. Because it's a great collection that has an example of has examples of all the different kinds of stories that Lovecraft wrote. And it's a great book because you can continue right on with the other Penguin volumes. So that's just a bit of what I will be talking about in this series. There are a lot of other stories and a lot of other books that I will be talking about. These are the ones probably that I'll be focusing on for the most part in the beginning of this video series. But this is going to be an ongoing video series. It'll probably last a while. Yeah, so there you go. The essential classics of horror. You have anything to add, Roger? Well, Roger has reminded me that I forgot to mention The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. And that is certainly, of course, an essential classic of horror. So we will be talking about that, as well as some other Arthur Machen work. Roger is kind of an essential classic of horror himself. And he will, of course, be joining me for every video. Isn't that exciting, Roger? Yes, it's a thrill. I will catch you next time.